So I had this great desire to, because every time I used to go to India, people used to ask me, how did you do it? And there's the mindset issue as we address in the book. And I said, I think instead of repeating it every time, I might as well write a book. Then I said, well, no one's interested only in trying to figure out what I did. I think we should write a bigger issue, which is, where are these two countries headed in commercial terms? We did not want to take up political issues, and the book actually skirts it. And the reason it skirts is because many people who are better experienced than us had written on the political dimensions of this relationship. So we've actually just skirted it, other than saying that Indians have a mindset issue which is going to be difficult. And I remember when I was telling my 90-year-old mother that I'm going to write a book on India and China, her reaction was horrifying. She still remembers 62, and that is true to a lot of people. So we did not want to touch the politics. Not that politics is not important. Our view was that China has had political differences since 1950 with nearly all its neighbors. First it was Russia, now it's Japan, then it's ASEAN. It's had differences, and yet commercial logic is separate. The Chinese have an amazing ability of separating commercial logic with politics, and therefore we should concentrate on how to benefit from this amazing ability of Chinese to separate the politics from the commercial side. And how can we do that? Now, while one was there and one saw in India, you saw these number of, there are about 125 companies Indian companies in China. There are another 135 Chinese companies in India, and this was growing as we went through this last decade. And that's when it struck us that maybe we should be looking at how are they creating these businesses? What are the challenges both sides face? The actual, and it was like in a way, part of it is a DIY for a company wanting to set up in India or China. And then we got another sense of this, that you got India and China both producing global companies. And I remember Anil and I had this discussion that if these companies are going to win in two of the biggest emerging markets, then they surely must be very competitive globally. And Western multinationals need to look at this phenomena of these national champions of both these countries becoming successful in each other's countries. Because to succeed in India for a Chinese company means they really reach some level, and vice versa. So we looked at this angle of these companies doing well in these countries, and what were the ingredients that made them successful. Now, it's not to say that there were not many failures. There are failures as well. But as they say, failures are never recognized. It's the winners who get the glory. So what we have got is 5 Indian companies and 5 Chinese companies who are reasonably well succeeded in different parts of the business. Now, just to take Ambassador Pillai's issue about how this relationship will go, I skipped to the last chapter. So the last chapter is actually where we are dreaming, where this relationship will be in 2020. And we talk about a conference hall being prepared in Delhi, in the CII conference hall, where we are saying in one hall, the railway ministry from Beijing is sitting down with the railway board to sign large contracts on bullet trains and fast trains worth billions of dollars, where Chinese costs were the lowest compared to everyone else. And Indian government, I'm talking about 2020, I know it horrifies a lot of people when I say that. 2020, we have large contracts being signed between this, because they can provide the infrastructure cheaper. They've already experimented it. By 2020, their trains are running reasonably well. On the other side, on the other hall, a very large Indian generic manufacturer is signing a license deal with Chinese Academy of Science for creation of an oncology drug. The cost structure when both India and China collaborate will be half that what would happen in a Western country in a molecule research. It benefits both. The center will be set up in Hangzhou. I set up the company first in Hangzhou. And it would produce all kinds of molecules jointly together in R&D. So this is where we thought it would go. If politics is separated, the Indians cannot separate politics, and we talk about it in the book, but the Chinese have an ability to separate the politics. That is one. Second, the way the trade deficit with India is growing, we forecast that the trade deficit actually grow bigger. Today it's about $38 billion, just deficit. It will grow to $80, $85 billion. And the reason is because both the countries are at different levels of where they are in terms of their manufacturing. India doesn't have an export manufacturing sector. China has an extremely great export manufacturing sector, and therefore India can never sell much to China. But what we are saying is that the investments that will happen from China to cover the deficit and the export manufacturing, which will start with the investments in China. China has Asia's supply chains all tied up in China. They start from China, they end in China. The apple is produced, started, sub-assemblies all done in China. It goes all over the place and comes back to China. So unless India becomes part of that supply chain, the Asian supply chain, which is centered around China, India can never become an export manufacturing country. And Chinese investments and Chinese companies coming investing in India will allow India to be part of that very efficient logistics and supply chain. So that's what we are forecasting in the last chapter. So let me stop here. Anil has I'm sure has a lot of things to say on how the book came out.
Thank you, Ambassador Pillai. It's an honor to be here at this, and Professor Srivastava, thank you very much for organizing this. Just to kind of add a little bit of spice to the discussion, that while Girija and I and Hayan and I, we agree on many things. We don't agree on everything on this topic. If we did, at least one of us would be redundant. And so, in terms of, I wouldn't put myself in the category of a Sinophile. In fact, I'm avowedly not a Sinophile. And I say that even though, actually, in the interest of full disclosure, Hayan Wan, our third author, she and I are married. And she is from China, hardcore from China, from Anhui, from Hefei, and just as I'm hardcore Indian, so I think I understand China well, and maybe that's why I'm not a Sinophile. And I don't believe that the reason why we are, let's say, optimistic about the China-India economic relationship, it's not because I see that China and India will kind of walk happily into the sunset holding arm in arm, and singing love songs. But it's really because of hard realities on the ground. And the hard realities on the ground are that while clearly there are tensions, geopolitical border between China and India, that despite those tensions, there isn't a fault line between China and India the way it is, at least so I see, between China and Japan. That's number one. Number two is that China has got plenty on its plate. East China Sea, South China Sea, and the last thing Chinese leaders want is to have more on their plate across the Himalayas. Given the lack of any fault line, so therefore, the Chinese leaders, I believe, mean what they say, which is that eventually we will find a peaceful resolution to the border issues. Let's basically put them aside. Maybe the next generation will find a solution, and let's do business. And I think they mean what they say. Another thing that I would add to this is that, of course, one fundamental premise of the book, and if that premise is wrong, basically the book is useless or pointless. And the basic premise is that India will make it. And by make it, what I mean, not grow at 4%, and I'm not saying grow at 10%. I mean, if it grows at 10%, then the book is actually wildly pessimistic rather than optimistic. But even if India grows at 7%, 6%, 8%, then even at those numbers, in real GDP terms, not PPP adjusted, India will be the third or fourth largest economy in the world by 2025. And we know about how economic relationships happen. It's the gravitational force of market size. And if India grows at that rate, China's economy, by the way, as we all know, has nowhere to go but slow down. India's economy, perhaps, has nowhere to go but to speed up a bit, at least a bit. And so therefore, when Chinese companies look around in the world at which are the biggest and fastest growing market opportunities, India is not the only place, but India is one of the most attractive market opportunities. And if Chinese companies don't go after these, and of course aided, abetted, encouraged by the Chinese government, then clearly the Japanese and the Koreans and the Americans and the Europeans are going to be playing in India. And do the Chinese want to kind of leave all that opportunity? It's unlikely given China's behavior. So those are the reasons, Ambassador Pillai, why purely from a, let's say, a hard-headed perspective, we see the story play out. Just one more thing I would add is that which is one of the underlying premises behind the book, and Girija alluded to that, is that so far over the last 12 years, the economic relationship has been defined largely by trade. The investment figures are tiny. But actually, if you look at Chinese investment figures, not just in India, or Indian investment figures, but we look at Chinese investment in the US, in Europe, etc., it's tiny, And so therefore, investment numbers for both China and India outside their borders are still early stages. If you think of how many Chinese companies are playing in the US, tiny, a handful, or in Europe, or in India, or Indian companies in US, or Europe, or China. And so therefore, these are early days. But our assumption is that over the next 10 years, the economic relationship between China and India is likely to be defined a whole lot more by investment than by trade. And that's why I focus on corporate linkages rather than trade relationship. So with that, maybe I will leave a lot more, hopefully, for further discussion.
Thank you. Stepping forward, Pradeep Pant, I think he's known to you, is actually a Singaporean in most respects. He's now started his own consultancy. He was formerly in Kraft. Pradeep. He's a wonderful speaker.
Thank you, sir.
Only 5 minutes.
Okay. Since you said that, I have to tell the audience the story which took place 8-9 days ago. So, Ambassador Pillai was speaking at the President Nathan's birthday, and Mr. Chandra Das threatened him, saying, if you speak more than 5 minutes, I will cut off the mic. And Ambassador Pillai told him that, listen, being a good Malayali, I don't need a mic. My voice will be heard anyway. Also, this applies to me also. I don't really. So when Girija asked me to be a part of the panel, the question I asked him was, I said, listen, I don't run an Indian business, haven't run an Indian business with interests in China or vice versa. So what do you want to hear from me? And he said, read the book and tell me as an operator of a global business, if you take anything out of that book for yourself. And first of all, I did read the book. And the second thing is that there's a lot of learnings for an operator like me, and indeed a lot of flashbacks on things which I've done now fall within a conceptual framework as I read the book. Two nuggets that I really picked up, two big ideas. I don't know how many of you actually read the book so far, but when you do, there are two very big ideas in there. One which says, when you're thinking of China and India, think convergence, don't think complementarity. A lot of people try to say, what does China do that India doesn't, and vice versa. But think of these two things as two big ships sailing together. Are there learnings and frameworks that you can transfer between these markets to accelerate the growth in both the places? That was one big idea. And the second associated idea was China not only as a part of China's strategy, India not only as a part of India's strategy, but a China-India strategy as a part of global strategy. And one very, very useful strategic input that I got out of this was look at cross-fertilizing these two markets by going around the problem. Enter both these markets by going to a third place. And there were cases like the Jaguar case, where Tata Motors entered China through buying Jaguar. A Turkish company called Yildiz entered by buying Godiva, and Bright Foods entered India by buying Weetabix. And I entered and scaled up my operations in both these markets by buying Cadbury and Danone biscuits. It would not have been possible for us to go out and buy local companies in China and India. We tried for years, but we went out, bought global players, and brought up scale in these markets. And then we started thinking. So for 15 years, I've run with one company or another. I've run both these markets. And if you look at these markets, there are a lot of frameworks and learnings that travel across these. And let me share with you some that I think really, really have traction. The first obvious one is both countries have the potential and the capability to produce low-cost capital goods and low-cost spares. That's an obvious one. Are we leveraging it enough across both or not today? I don't think yet, but in craft we had started talking about bringing in equipment to make biscuits and chocolates across these two markets. The second one is the area of innovation. When you talk about innovation in foods, a lot of people first react and say that, listen, the food products that work in China cannot work in India, and vice versa. That's the wrong way of looking at it, because you've got to think of the framework. There's this friend of mine, Prem Kumar, who got hired to run the Pepsi Foods business in India. The Pepsi Foods business wasn't succeeding in India. They were trying to sell their global products, Lay's, Cheetos, etc., not getting off the ground. So what he did was, based on consumer insights, he went and industrialized local snacks. Stuff like, it's called kurkure, for example. Those of you who know Indian snacks will know what I'm talking about. They packaged those and started selling them with the kind of marketing that Pepsi does. And they won the Indian market handsomely. It's a huge business now. Prem got transferred to China after that. He picked up the same idea and the same framework, looked at local Chinese snacking habits, and designed products using the same methodology and the same insight work that they had done in India for China. And the China Pepsi Foods business is now extremely successful. So carry the framework, not the product. In the area of foods, there are two other areas which we are working on already. One is the very, very important area of food safety. I think applies to both markets. Food safety and food standards harmonization. Until that happens, we'll always be slow. And there are things happening, there are dangers in the supply chain in these markets. You remember the melamine scandal. We've got to watch out for these. And associated with this is the whole area of nutrition. There is a lot of work being done by us and by other food companies in looking at nutrition from traditional products in India and China. and these will transport very easily between the two countries. There are learnings, both these are vast countries, there are huge learnings in the area of logistics and warehousing. My friend Robert, he's suffered both the markets, and I think that if you transport learnings across, there's a lot to be done. And lastly, in the area of trade management, China is well ahead of the curve in terms of trade development. Modern trade has truly arrived in China, whereas in India, it's in a nascent stage. So there's a lot of learnings as modern trade grows in India, which you can transport from China to India. And in China, they don't quite know how to manage traditional trade, the wholesalers and the distributors. And India is cutting edge as far as that is concerned. And we found that by putting the sales teams from both these markets together, we really upped our level of trade management. So, a common friend of ours, Professor Jagdish Sheth, wrote a book a few years ago called Chindia Rising. And he talked about, among other things, the fact that both are huge domestic markets, they're entrepreneurial, and R&D will be a big factor for both these markets going forward. So, let me reassure Ambassador Pillai, we are optimistic. My China business went, sir, from 100 million to 1 billion in 5 years. My India business went from 300 million to 1 billion in 5 years. And the transference of learning, knowledge, and frameworks has just started. So, if we do it well, if we keep aside the geopolitics, if we look at the business and the profit motive and running big businesses, the 1 billion will look small because in 5 years, I think we'll be running $10 billion business in both these markets. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep. Now, Jonathan, your turn. Jonathan is used to be the CEO of Ascendas Breed. Now he's in the top echelon of Ascendas in some other function.
Being the fourth on the last to speak, I'm not sure what else I could add after all the panelists have so eloquently allocated so many thoughts. And Ambassador, you're absolutely right. Just like you are a business person, so as much as we see problems, there's a lot of opportunities. But I may not articulate to the extent Robert has in terms of his angst or issues he may see, whether it's India or China. But nonetheless, anybody who walk into this market thinking that there are not going to be problems are probably not being realistic. Even for a simple market like Singapore, they are full of business issues that we need to basically maneuver on a day-to-day basis. So it's only logical to expect to see problems. Rather than approach it in a relatively scholarly manner, which obviously I'm not well equipped to do that, I'll probably approach the topic from a practical angle. As you may know, that Ascendas invests in both China and India. In fact, we entered both markets just a year apart. We entered India in 1994, entered China in 1995. There are some similarities in the way we enter the market. Both are largely part and parcel of our government-to-government initiative. But I guess the strategy we took in the two countries was very different. You would know that Ascendas is a real estate player, but nonetheless in China, we focus initially on industrial parks development. In India, we focus on IT parks development. And I think it boils back down to, probably to some extent, what Pradeep said earlier about just using the framework rather than specifics. Because ultimately, we're a real estate provider, we provide what our customers, which the underlying customers want, and we're just giving what the market demands. And at the point in time, that obviously makes sense. The book touched on convergence. Clearly, we're here for a launch, and I'm trying to kind of make you happy to say this. But the truth is, over time, we also see some degree of convergence in the strategies that not just the countries, but even players like us take. Clearly, China is no longer the China it was many years ago. It has moved from just industrial park, from a factory of the world, to more than that. So even as a strategy, you find that Ascendas over time has evolved beyond industrial parks to mixed-use development to business parks. While our strategy in India is still largely IT parks, but we're also beginning to move beyond IT parks to now to start doing industrial parks in India, largely because we all know that at the end of the day, in order for government to live many people off the poverty line, you can't just rely on services. You need to basically create jobs through manufacturing. But I think what probably both of those point back us to is really just the size of the market. 1.2, 1.3 billion people each. Obviously, India is still a lot lagging behind on a per capita GDP basis compared to China, but nonetheless it's off a very low base. So I think there are many opportunities there. And we used to say it's an India versus China, we moved to India and China. Now obviously we'll talk about how Indian companies invest in China and vice versa. I would argue that it's really the fact that it's not so much how all goes, it's really the fact that the sheer size of the market just leave all of us as in business people with very little option but to look at both markets seriously. It's not China or India. I wouldn't even say it's China and India. It's just facts of life that you can't change the fact a statistic has been repeated many times, which is 1/3 of the world population is either Chinese or Indian, like it or not. That's not going to change. And we also know that with where the world things are going, you will see demand in some of the traditional countries where consumption used to be driving growth. Those are increasingly diminished. And again, whether you like it or not, as much as you try to skate around politics, politics are such that they are also driving the way policymakers or governments think. And therefore, as a result, we do see certain pressure of the alternative to China and a few other arguments we see being developing. So clearly we saw, for instance, certain countries align themselves very closely with some other countries. So these inevitably will then drive how people will want to invest. And we know for a fact, other than obviously customers are investing in the two countries to pick up space, we also know the parties, or rather our partners in two of the countries, are increasingly also investing in the two countries, or even parties, or rather partners from non-China, non-Indian origin, are also investing in both countries. So I think at the end of the day, being a business person, I probably will go back to the same fundamental point. Like it or not, both are markets that we probably can't ignore. We can, as much as put up statistics or put up arguments very eloquently to argue for or against, there are always going to be issues that come along the way. I'm going back to the same thing, I know I'm repeating, like it or not, you just can't ignore them. So with that, I'll hand back to Jen.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think many of you are ready to go ask questions or make comments. May I just make one quick comment? The moderator always has the opportunity to have the last word, but this may not be the last word. First, I want to congratulate Pradeep on his excellent performance in India and China. I've never denied that you can make a lot of money and do good business. What I'm talking about is slightly something different, and that is whether on a long-term basis it is possible to develop growth between the two countries when you have large geopolitical issues. Girija said Chinese have a way of differentiating the geopolitical factors from the commercial logic, which I think is largely true, except that Chinese also have elephantine memories. They are a very ancient country, and therefore they remember, they never forget a slight, they never forget a favor. When the Western powers were breaking up China with extraterritoriality, America was one of the few countries, or the only country, that did not ask for extraterritoriality. The Chinese never forgot that. And what made Nixon's visit successful was a flashback into what happened. That's one. Second, the point made by Professor Gupta that there are no fault lines, I'm not so sure. If tomorrow our Dalai Lama nominates his successor from Tawang, Tawang is a major religious place in Arunachal Pradesh, which is known by the Chinese as Greater Tibet. If he nominates somebody from there, I think all bets are off, because Chinese consider Tibet as a core issue, and they wouldn't care two hoots about business logic or anything else. So things can go drastically wrong if you don't get the fundamentals of geopolitics settled. We don't know who Dalai Lama is going to appoint, but he is inclined to appoint somebody not from the Tibet controlled by China, but Tibet outside. In other words, the government in exile and so on. This can cause a lot of problems. That's the point I'm making. Opportunities, potential there are. So with that, may I open it to the House for questions, comments, and even the panelists to respond. Robin, you have a question, I see in your face.
Yes, I do.
You see?
I think the question is, with this impressive development that's potentially there, have the panel considered both the opportunities and the problems that are going to go with the accumulated waste that's going to come with that? Craft would be a fine example. Those products you were describing that were once homemade and sold in little paper packets are now sold in plastic disposables. Every Indian city is facing this, and every Chinese city as well. But there's also good business in waste. Has this been part of any of your considerations? Because the waste question is going to be something that's inescapable in this spectacular growth that you're both foreshadowing.
Okay. In fact, I had this in my notes, and I didn't get into it because it's a big subject. Two things I will say. In both these markets, our company and all other good operators that I know of are highly conscious of waste and energy consumption, water utilization, etc. For two very fundamental business reasons, even if you forget the altruistic reasons for a moment. Number one is there is enough evidence to show that if you're doing well in terms of being energy efficient, water efficient, and waste efficient, your cost of production actually goes down. So these are not conflicting objectives. The second one, which is a little wider, but becoming more and more important every day as we speak, is the fact that young employees now look at working for organizations which they think are serving a slightly higher purpose, including this business about going green. And they ask hard questions when they're being interviewed before they join the company. So I think for practical reasons as well as from the larger social good reasons, I think it's a big subject and on the radar of practically all operators in that.
In the book we talk about this issue. So we are saying, what are the opportunities in China? And we are not sort of taking vertically, but we are saying, what are the challenges which China faces in the next 10 years? And pollution and green energy is two major issues. So anyone who wants to really get into China and think there is a big market, these two areas are areas where they will concentrate. You can bring all kinds of industrial equipment, pollution control, chemicals, whatever required to handle the two issues which China faces. One is pollution. The second is how do we have non-renewable energy, renewable energy. And as we already have seen, China being the largest in terms of solar panels. India fast following both with wind and solar. Both these countries today are actually adding huge amounts in renewable energy sources as a priority. Now this is an internal priority, but if you're a businessman and you say, what am I going to get out of it? And like waste, these are the same issues. Pollution and green energy. Huge opportunity. In fact, we talk about it in one of the opportunities chapter.
Yes? Yes? Can you just address, give your name?
Hi, this is Venkat here from Malam. I'm also representing ICA. Deja one small doubt, which is for any Indians or for any businessman you can start. For a partnership to work, it should be equal. Any partnership, anywhere. When I look at China, the kind of infrastructure developments which is needs, we have big operation there. Reserves, money, everything different as compared to India. Two, if you look at it, demography is different in both places. Third, if you look at it, the governance is completely different. One is dictatorial and party line, other one is completely democratic. How these two, elephant and ant, work together and ensure that there is going to be a meaningful win-win partnership between the two? It seems to be next to impossible, in the pathway.
I once made a big mistake in one of the press interviews in China, where someone asked me, how will this dragon and elephant work together? And I said, one is a mythical animal and one is a real animal. I got pilloried by the Chinese press when I remarked. So yes, there are two very different. That is true, and that is exactly the dragon and elephant story. I don't think, we are talking commercial investments between companies. We are talking about individual companies making investments in markets. Indian companies make investments in the US and vice versa. The differences are huge, much bigger than even Chinese markets. So we are actually not taking, we are taking into account the differences, and that is why the roadmap is different from an Indian company in China and vice versa, because the things are so different. Actually, there is a whole chapter on how to manage government in China. How do you understand the Communist Party, the party secretary, the vice mayor? They keep changing. So there is a whole issue of how do you handle government relations? How do you handle brand building in China, which is very different from India, because there you have to build a brand for the customer, for the government, and for your staff, because you have such a high staff turnover in China. So all of them are, these differences come up as you go to the operating level. So it's not that everything is similar. I think when you start really creating companies and building businesses, there are differences, and these are the differences which people wanted to know, because they are worried about, like the biggest worry that if you ask any Indian company, why aren't you in China? Oh, they speak Mandarin, what do I do? And I'm saying to myself, this is a mindset problem. This is a complete mindset problem. So I think there are differences, and they are highlighted actually, and those are the challenges of operating in China.
Just to add another, perspective is that one might want to rethink a little bit the basic premise, which is that for a partnership to emerge, to be successful, to thrive, it needs to be a partnership between equals. I would rethink that premise, because partnerships, for them to emerge and work, thrive, it's really a function of opportunity far more than equality. So as a concrete example, let's look at, say, the relationship between China and the US from, say, 1990 to 2010. Just look at the situation in 1995, economically, technologically, in whatever dimension, China was tiny compared to the US. But the point is that China offered a growing market, an extremely low cost structure, whereas the US offered technology and know-how and a big market. And so it was really that presence of opportunities which led the two to partner rather than equality.
Yes, gentlemen, at the back.
My name is Stanley. I'm a media consultant. As I say, I'm a Chinese who works with a lot of Indian companies. Okay, my question is to Mr. Girija Pandey is, as a former chairman of Tata Consultancy, you were responsible for setting up TCS's China operation. My question is, do you think, because we've all got this stereotype where it's the Chinese who do the manufacturing and the Indians who do the services, do you think it's ever possible for the Chinese to get services in the way the Indians have and to build up service industry in the same way that India has? And is it possible for the Indian manufacturers in things like auto components to manufacture for the China market?
So, in fact, with this convergence and complementarity issue, we talk about this fact that China will build its services capability. It has to. It has gone to a stage where it is beyond just manufacturing. And services are really not just IT services or BPO services. Services, a whole range of services which China can provide pretty efficiently to its own domestic market. It doesn't need to go everywhere else. So the Chinese will improve, build on services. That is where the bulk of the GDP will also come from in future. So I don't think it's that they can't do services. And India will have to get into manufacturing for 2 or 3 reasons. Number one, with the kind of youth buzz that India has seen, I think Raj mentioned 1 million per month people coming into the job market. Without a big manufacturing base, you can never employ so many people in services. So the new government is talking about this very much, and everyone is talking about manufacturing. So I think as China vacates some end of lower end of manufacturing, I mean, we are at the moment doing a project for a company which is in China, in auto components. Cost structure in South China too high, cannot manage it. Where do we move it? And one of the locations is India. Now, India still needs to settle a lot of things before manufacturing becomes big. So, you just talked about auto components. At this point of time, OEMs are sitting in all countries, both the countries. China has a 16 million passenger car last year, India had 3 million. India is going to grow much faster in passenger cars, China is going to grow as well. OEMs, the big, large OEMs are in both countries. They want tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers who are in both countries. So they are asking their suppliers from India to move to China. They are asking their Chinese suppliers to move to India. So in fact, the auto industry is a classic example of how they are driving their suppliers, and the auto industry is pretty organized in terms of supplier 1, supplier 2, supplier 3 with certain quality standards in both these markets. And we are seeing increasingly auto companies asking their suppliers to move.
Maybe just add on to the comment. I think at the end of the day, while we focus a lot about China investing in India, India investing in China, but if I may just stand on from the perspective of Chinese companies for a while argue that if we do believe the costs are getting higher in China, or more importantly, we believe that the market in China, obviously, has been, after 2 decades of growth, has been kind of get smaller. I think India does present a very big market for the Chinese manufacturers. And we all know the infrastructural issues we face in India. If you try to manufacture even very cheaply in China, Vietnam, anywhere in the world, by the time you bring to the hands of the consumers in India, it becomes so expensive because of the infrastructure cost that comes with it. So I absolutely see a very clear case why Chinese players, Chinese manufacturers want to basically find a way to tap onto that consumer base India has. While it's still very preliminary, we know for a fact that many Chinese parties or partners we have in China, obviously, have been asking us about India. More so, I guess, in the last 6 months or so. Asking us what they can do to tap the market. Fair enough, along the way they say certain things that's not very complimentary to the Indian government, I will repeat. But nonetheless, the amount of interest that we received in the last 6 months is actually quite something. And I think at the end of the day, back to the question of partnership. Partnership doesn't mean you can only have 2 partners. You may have 3 partners. Someone that perhaps facilitate the bridging of Indian and Chinese firms. Well, of course, as a Singaporean, I'd argue that Singapore could be a logical partner to them, but it doesn't have to. But of course, all things in life, everybody needs to bring this relevance to the table. That's how we struck a commercial agreement, whether it's equal or an equal partner. It boils down to, do you have something that the other partners in the game doesn't have, or that's valuable? I think that's probably the fundamental question as opposed to percentage shareholding. Because ultimately, the pie is spend 30% of a larger pie may be much better than 51% of a smaller pie.
Dr. Pilot? There's just one second.
Just to add on, the question about can India be an industrial, can India be a manufacturing power? I think it's certainly a very relevant question, because if you look at India over the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, it has not proven that it can be a manufacturing power. However, if you look at certain industries, for instance, you look at certain companies, so Hyundai, which is the second largest auto manufacturer in India, that Hyundai, in fact, has their biggest auto manufacturing, global manufacturing center after South Korea in India. And Hyundai exports cars from India to 50 countries, including Western Europe. So clearly, India, across the country, hasn't built up the infrastructure that's needed to be a manufacturing power. But it has built it in pockets. And where it is doing extremely well. So the question really now, or the challenge for the Modi government, is to make that a countrywide phenomenon and not an isolated phenomenon.
Yes, Dr. Park.
Thank you, Chairman. This is for both the testimony and President. There is a history that India and China have worked together on global economic issues in certain forums. They have done so at WTO, they have done so at the UN panel on climate change. Now, it's interesting to note that for the last 4 to 5 years, there are issues on which both China and India have had differences with the West. Intellectual property, for example, which affects Indian generic manufacturers, affects China's entertainment industry. Data security, a critical issue. Also, something as rudimentary as visas, permitting Indians and Chinese better facilities and permissions for travel to the Western world. Surprisingly, there's no evidence that India and China are talking with each other on these issues so that they can present a better alternative agenda to the West. Do you sense this is because that between India and Chinese businesses or agencies, there is now a sense that both are also competing with each other in certain spheres of international business, where they might be holding higher proprietary knowledges and advantages. That is, Indian businesses might be thinking that in certain areas we do hold the edge over the Chinese businesses. And Chinese businesses might also be thinking likewise about Indian businesses, and they sense the Indian businesses to be much stronger competitors for them in certain areas of world markets, which they weren't before. So, is there a possibility that you think that this might lead to both of them, accepting the fact that yes, they are different from the West in several aspects of regulations, but they're not going to act on it united just because they are competitors?
I think the biggest example of this was seen in Khartoum, where India and China were on one side on the whole issue of green gases and the whole area of how restrictions are being placed, completely aligned. And it was really the first time that the governments realized that and it's 3 or 4 areas, not just on this. It's on sustainability, because both want to grow and both want to have space to grow. It's on global governance. We've been hearing today and tomorrow the announcement of the BRIC Bank, which is going to match the World Bank equivalent in terms of funding. Both are collaborating very closely. In fact, the 2 of them are collaborating very closely. So this whole global governance of how governance should be run for global institutions is a common theme for both. Certainly on sustainability, there is a common theme. So I think in some of these areas, the government to government issues are very similar, and they collaborate on wherever they are. The private sector may have comparative issues with each other, but that's not what is coming in the way. I mean, every country has private sector which has a different view of the other. But on these broad issues which affect both of them, they are pretty closely aligned actually. They tend to in fact even work together sometimes on these issues.
I think, it's true that at times they have been aligned, but I see that the relationship between China and India will continue to be one of both cooperation and competition. So harmony as well as friction. But I don't see that as a problem in the sense that if you look at the relationship between Germany and France, or between China and the US. And so I think relationships between countries continue typically in a context of both cooperation and collaboration, or cooperation and competition. So I think that will continue. And just for instance, how the creation of the BRICS Bank might emerge, and we have to see the details that come out. But if you just look at what the media is saying, is that the likely outcome will be $100 billion funding, of that 50 from China, the other 4 countries in BRICS then contributing the remaining 50 billion. So that's one issue. But the second issue, of course, is so where is the headquarters of the BRICS Bank going to be? Apparently, China wants it to be in Shanghai, and India wants it to be in New Delhi. And we have to see how that plays out. I don't rule out the possibility, but I don't rule it in either. This issue of tension as well as collaboration, that it may be $100 billion funding, although the other 4 countries are saying, let it be 50 billion, so each of us contributes an equal amount. So the question really is it a BRICS bank or a Chinese bank called the BRICS Bank? Okay. And so now if it is 100 billion, 50 from China, located in Shanghai, okay, so that's one kind of reality. Another is, okay, 100 billion, 50 from China, but located in Delhi. That's a different kind of reality. So it's possible, but not a given, that the other 4 countries in BRICS, other than China, might actually see reasons for the BRICS Bank to be located in New Delhi. So that, but we have to see how it happens. And so that would be, again, it's really sort of commonality of certain interests, but in a context of competition and conflict in certain other ways.
The instructions to me are that I must stop by 7:20 and pass it. He wanted to ask the question.
Well, I'm not a tradesperson, I'm a diplomat. It's my job, or it used to be anyway, when I was not a civilian, to sort of facilitate trade. I find a modicum of empathy with Ambassador Pillai's apprehensions. That is because, at this point in time, it's true that China believes is a part of the Chunguoman, the China Creed, shelving differences and finding common grounds, and India comes in within that ambit. And everything is hunky-dory because China has decided, by the way, that differences must be shelved and common grounds must be found. But the time would be up to the Chinese. When it politically suits them, it is quite possible that the rug will be pulled away from under. It may not happen in the long run. In the long run, we're all dead. But it may happen. So mathematically, it's not a perfect equilibrium. So that is where the danger lies. And this is what I think Ambassador Pillai is hinting at, or even if it isn't, it sort of buttresses his apprehensions.
You had a question? Okay. Sorry. Surya, I'm coming back.
Satya from KPMG. I will keep it very brief. One of the areas we haven't talked about is the question of people. And, foreign multinationals have been very successful in really using the Indian management pool to build global talent pools. Do the authors look at Chinese companies in 2020 or 2025 and see how Chinese multinationals can leverage that talent pool to build really global businesses? People like Pradeep Pant, for example, working in a Chinese MNC, like higher.
Surya? You see, these are regular attendees for conferences, so I know their name.
I'm Surya from ISIS. So apart from the overarching geopolitical aspects, there is also this concern in India about so-called security-sensitive sectors in which the Chinese companies are not supposed to be present. Are there similar concerns of this kind or some other kind in China about Indian companies? Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Mishra.
Thank you very much. I'm Satish Mishra and I work in the firm called Strategic Asia in Jakarta. I have two questions. The title says, Growing India-China Economic Ties and What They Mean for the World. We really haven't heard about what it really means for the world, so it would be nice if the authors could talk a bit about it. I think the second issue is clearly that so far we have been concentrating on a dynamic which involves India and China. But the rest of the world is not a kind of static background. And I think for us to grasp the author's thinking on the second part, we need to understand not only how the changing dynamic between India and China, what it means for the world, but what it means for the world in 2020. Thank you.
Thank you. The rest of the 9 minutes I will give to the panelists to respond. So once again, start with my friend Girija Pandit.
So one sentiment that comes through in all the questions is what we deal with as a mindset problem. Everyone is worried about, will China pull the rug, will it allow? Businesses don't think like that. Businesses think of opportunities, we just talked about it, and I think businesses, if they can see opportunities, will go and go to those countries. Yes, many things can happen. This is geopolitics, and really it's something which actually we have stayed away. We have actually stayed away from the geopolitical story. We have kept it at the corporate level, apart from an overview which we started in chapter 1. So I think that's important to know. The reason why, Satish, we are saying how in the globe is again the companies. If Indian and Chinese companies succeed in the biggest emerging markets, they can become global champions. If they do not succeed in these markets, take Lenovo, we give an example of Lenovo. India is now the second largest market for them. It's home for them. They have succeeded they are the largest today in PCs. They have succeeded. It was a long haul, and you will read the long haul of Lenovo. So they have now become globally a very competitive, so competitive they are number 1. So I think that's the global angle to it. One issue was the talent story that someone asked. I think the talent management in Chinese companies, Indian companies, is an issue we've talked about, but you are talking about cross-fertilization of Indian talent into Chinese. What I have seen, not very much, is that some of the global Chinese companies realize the value of Indian global talent. Like for example, the Lenovo marketing head and the Lenovo marketing team used to be in Bangalore, and the head for global marketing was an Indian. But it's more exceptional than it has happened. What of course has happened is that many Chinese companies who operate in India have actually taken an Indian name, and we talk about this Rajiv Wong, who is a Huawei guy in India. So they have actually switched the names. So that's what we have talked about.
Let me just share a perspective on this. The world, meaning outside China and India, and what does that have to do with the China-India economic linkage story? And probably 3 aspects to it. So number 1 is that in every one of the cases of Indian companies in China and Chinese companies in India, and there are some failed cases or failure cases or less successful cases, but some that are, but most that we focus on are highly successful ones. That the successful cases are all where the Indian company did not take an in China for China perspective, or the Chinese company did not take in India for India. But actually it was to bring a global perspective. Indian company in China, how can we leverage our global strengths to succeed in China? And how can we leverage our China operations to become stronger globally in markets outside India and China? And similarly, in reverse, so for instance, Huawei in India is that obviously it's a hugely important market for them. But at the same time, Huawei entered in 1998 to set up an R&D center in India, which is the second biggest R&D center after Shenzhen. In fact, they started selling in India in 2003. So again, Chinese companies to bring a global perspective rather than in India. So that's number one. Number two is that both Chinese and Indian companies are making acquisitions in third countries. Typically, here looking at developed markets, Europe, US, etc. So it's like Tata Motors buying Jaguar Land Rover, Geely buying Volvo, Bright Foods buying Weetabix, and so on. And that these acquisitions then actually make it easier for them to succeed. It's like who would ever imagine Tata Motors doing anything approaching success in China, but they are mightily successful, and it's because of Jaguar Land Rover. So that's a second way in which the world comes in. And a third way in which it comes in, actually in the China-India economic linkage story, if I pick up on what Pradeep, you were talking about, is that in my analysis and research, that the multinationals actually are ahead of Chinese or Indian companies in taking an integrated perspective. So if we talk to IBM, IBM doesn't look at IBM India as an isolated in India for India or IBM China, but they look at it from an integrated perspective. GE, Wanderlei. And so actually the third country multinationals are ahead of the game in bringing an integrated perspective. And clearly, if it makes sense for them to bring an integrated perspective, it makes for Chinese companies to do that, for Indian companies to do that.
No, I just amplify the point the gentleman was asking as to what the impact on the world is going to be of this alliance or common thinking between these two markets. And if I look at the world as a corporation, a global corporation, as a microcosm of the world, then by 2020, big decisions in the area of product development, R&D, HR policies, way of manufacturing would not be taken in the Midwest America, but will be taken out here, addressing the two largest markets in the world. That's, I think, how the globe is going to be impacted going forward.
No, I don't think I say words of wisdom. Just two quick points. Firstly, as much as we say earlier that long term all of us are on that, but to be fair, a lot of things that for you to see results in the future, you need to start to seed some of these initiatives now. So therefore, I think while we're doing stuff, balancing some short-term consideration, you also need to take the long-term into consideration, see what are big directional things, and if those make sense, you can start to prepare for those long-term directional change now by putting some of these initiatives. Secondly, what makes sense for one company, one player, doesn't mean it makes sense for another company, another player. As much as looking at a common market, I think each of us will then have to customize to and adjust what makes sense to us. So I think at the end of the day, it's about leveraging on your strength, put into place what you think will make sense, and what can be differentiating each of us in the market we're talking about, be China, India, or China, India, or the rest of the world. So we just have to adjust what makes sense, and at the end of the day, I don't think we're aiming for a Me Too situation where everybody adopts a similar situation. If we're all in that kind of situation, then clearly the law of competition will tell us that we will be eliminated by the market. So I guess all of us got to find the right place in the market.
Thank you first to the panelists, then to the audience. I want to congratulate the authors, the three authors for the book. The book has started such deep discussions on various aspects of doing business in China and doing business in India, and the totality of what India and China can bring to the world economy. I think that itself makes that book a compelling reading. I've said that from the beginning. I think it's a very readable book. I think you should all read it if you have not, because I think it adds to our pool of knowledge. Whether I sound a discordant note or not, I still admire what has been done, and I congratulate the authors. With that, I hand it over to, I think, yourself or the young